Good afternoon, everybody. This is Ken Brown. How is everybody today? I'd like to welcome you to our webinar. We're going to focus on providing an update on federal brownfields policies and funding here in Washington. And then for those of you who are coming to the National Brownfields Leadership Summit in a couple of weeks, we have some items that we want to talk with you about to make sure that you're prepared for Washington, D.C. So here we go. Let's see, there we go. First, for those of you who don't know the Center for Creative Land Recycling, we are one of the nation's leading providers of technical assistance and training on brownfields revitalization and other related land reuse activities. CCLR, as you probably know, is one of 3 designated brownfields technical assistance providers under the EPA Brownfields TAB program. We're part of a team that works nationally, and then we are responsible, the lead provider in EPA regions 2, 9, and 10. And we are also a leader as part of the National Brownfields Coalition in national efforts to strengthen federal brownfields policies and to increase funding for various federal brownfields programs. Today we're going to talk about, we're going to provide a brownfields policy and funding update. We're going to talk about preparing for the upcoming National Brownfields Leadership Summit, particularly our Capitol Hill Day, and then we'll take any questions. And so for anybody who does have questions, you can type them in the question box on your screen. And then joining me today is Matt Ward from Sustainable Strategies, DC. So he's going to help with our presentation today. So thanks, Matt, for being with us today.
Good to be here with you, Ken, and everybody else.
So before we get going, just another advertisement for the National Brownfields Leadership Summit. It's still not too late to register. We don't have many seats left for the conference, but we have a few left. It's going to be an exciting event. Day 1, which is Tuesday, September 25th, will feature roundtable discussions with key federal agencies, including EPA, HUD, DOT, the Economic Development Administration, and the Department of Agriculture. We will provide updates on key federal policies and funding opportunities, and you'll get to hear directly from the leaders of the federal agencies who are responsible for these programs. We will hear directly from agencies and other experts about implementation of the new Brownfields law and the Opportunity Zones program, which we're going to touch on today. And then on day 2, Wednesday, September 26th, we'll kick it off with a congressional briefing on Capitol Hill, and we'll have the key authors of the new Brownfields law and other leaders present. We will be inviting congressional staff to join us at the briefing. And then after the briefing, we will divide up into teams, and CCLR will be scheduling meetings for everybody coming to DC to go meet with various congressional offices. So if you are coming, we look forward to seeing you in a couple of weeks. And if you have not registered yet, it's not too late. We still have room for a few more. So here's a link right here. You can also find it at just cclr.org, cclr.org. And if you click on events, you'll get to the Brownfields Leadership Summit. But this link will take you directly there. I'll leave it there for a couple of seconds in case anyone wants to write this down. We'll send a link to these slides after the event as well. But please come to the summit. A special thank you to the Brownfields Leadership Summit sponsors. We really appreciate your support. Without you, the event would not be possible. And now we're going to jump into our federal policy priorities for the summit and beyond. They include effective and timely implementation of the new BUILD Act, which reauthorizes the federal Brownfields law. We are working to increase federal funding for key programs that support Brownfields revitalization, and then we are pushing for effective and timely implementation of the new Opportunity Zones program. So we're going to talk about each of these items briefly, and then talk about things that those of you who are coming to DC can do to prepare for our Brownfield Summit. So with that, I'm going to turn this over to Matt, who's going to talk about implementation of the BUILD Act, Brownfields Reauthorization Law.
Thank you, Ken. Hi, everybody. This is Matt Ward at Sustainable Strategies. Go way back with many of you. Go way back to Ken Brown when his name was Ken Brownfields. Ken, we've been working together for 20 years. After about 15 years after the passage of the 2002 Brownfields Revitalization Act, we were very pleased that in March 2017, Congress passed a new law, the Brownfield Utilization, Investment, and Leveraging Development, or BUILD Act. And so there are fairly straightforward pieces of this legislation, and I will highlight a few of them for folks who might not know the details. And then on the next slide, we'll talk about what we think is going to happen with the implementation of the BUILD Act. So first of all, there's a new kind of grant called the multi-purpose grant. And instead of having to apply for an assessment grant to do your assessments and reuse planning, and then having to apply separately for a cleanup grant, you know, oftentimes you're applying for a cleanup grant when there's an opportunity, when you have developers. Sometimes these things happen rapidly, and to have to say, well, we've got to wait for the next EPA grant cycle to come out, we've got to apply, we've got to wait to see if we win that grant, we need to wait for the paperwork to come into place. That can be a very long cycle. You can apply up front for a multi-purpose grant that can be used for assessment. It can be used for site reuse planning and all the things that you could typically do with an assessment grant. And you could use it for cleanup. These grants, Congress said, can be up to $1 million each. And we'll talk a little bit more about where we think those are going. Second of all, in law, it has always been that EPA Brownfield cleanup grants were limited to $200,000. There was an ability for EPA to provide a waiver to make them slightly higher, but they were typically $200,000 cleanup grants. Those often are not levels that are sufficient to deal with sites that have significant cleanup issues. And so now Congress has said that cleanup grants can be $500,000, and actually with an EPA waiver, they can go up to $650,000. Then there are a couple pieces related to the CERCLA or Superfund law liability that can come and cause real concerns for parties that come into ownership, a possession of a contaminated site, and we very much want to make sure that local governments, local communities are not saddled with Superfund liability when they're trying to do the right thing by going into a site and cleaning it up for community revitalization or economic development. And so there are a couple of provisions that clarify and improve liability protections. The first is that it's always been in law that a municipality or a local government that acquired a site in its function as a sovereign, that is by eminent domain, by tax foreclosure, by other kinds of public actions in which you go and take over a site that is stalled and that is causing problems in the community. There was vague and difficult to interpret language about whether the protections for cities that use their sovereign powers to take sites are actually protected from Superfund liability. That's been made much more clear in the law, and so we now know that in the right cases, you can use your powers of eminent domain and tax foreclosure and other acquisition procedures without being liable under Superfund. And then the other is that we know that to get the protections from Superfund liability under what's called the bona fide prospective purchaser exemption from Superfund liability, that is, you're a purchaser or acquirer of a site, you have to have conducted all appropriate inquiries, which anybody working with brownfields surely knows is the phase one environmental site assessment that has to be done before you acquire a brownfield to protect yourself from liability and get other benefits. Well, the all appropriate inquiry standard really was not created until the 2002 Brownfields law from Congress, in which they provided clear specifications about what all appropriate inquiries means. Well, what happens if a local government acquired a site in 2001 or 1991 or 1961? I can assure you that a site that was acquired by a municipality in 1961, you probably were not doing ASTM Standard 1597 Phase 1 environmental all appropriate inquiries, because it was about 30, 40 years from being invented. And so now Congress says as long as a locality is not the polluter and acquires a site and does not cause or contribute to further pollution releases or contamination issues, you can't have acquired a site and then, thrown radioactive waste over your shoulder into the schoolyard or some other irresponsible action like that. But if you did not cause or contribute to pollution, you're going to be eligible to get cleanup assessment and cleanup funding. Okay. Prior to this 2017 law, nonprofit organizations, many of which are active in revitalizing brownfields, could not get cleanup grants. Nonprofits are now eligible for those EPA cleanup grants, and the law barred the use of any funding by a grant recipient for administrative costs. Now up to 5% of those grants can cover administrative costs. So that's the key parts of the BUILD Act. Ken, if you move on to the next slide, we'll talk about where we think the BUILD Act implementation is going. In short, it's going, and I'm skipping a slide. CCLR and the National Association of Local Government Environmental Professionals joined with several other organizations and with brownfield practitioners out there and looked at the implementation of the BUILD Act and said, we want to make sure that EPA gets its guidelines and policies right for implementing the BUILD Act. We put together a letter. We met with EPA Brownfield Director David Lloyd and his team, and we provided some comments, which I'll just summarize quickly here. One is that if you can get these large multipurpose grants, we're hoping that there not be highly prescriptive and limited requirements associated with you can only spend so much on assessment and only so much on planning and only so much on cleanup. The purpose of a multipurpose grant is to provide the flexibility for a municipality that's dealing with one or more brownfield sites to move money into the site that has become ready for redevelopment or where an opportunity is ready to move forward to get these done. And so we've called for no strict parameters on the use of funds and the ability to use these on a variety of sites and eligible activities. We also said that while we're glad that the EPA Brownfield grants can go up to $500,000 because Congress has not yet chosen to increase the amount of money that's available in the pot every year for grants, which is part of why we're doing this Brownfield Leadership Summit and asking people to be part of the process, that the largest grants should only go to those applicants and sites that can show the most need and the most meritorious. That's a new word that I invented, meritoriums. They're the meritorious projects. And that the $200,000 cleanup grants is a good default level to go. We looked at the fact that over the last 8 years, EPA has done, I believe it's 83 Brownfield area-wide planning grants, where you can really do solid work in preparing a corridor or area of several brownfields for the kind of neighborhood improvements, infrastructure upgrades, market activities, and other things you need to turn around a degraded brownfield neighborhood. EPA has talked about ending the area-wide planning grant program. We've talked quite a bit with them. We do believe that they realize the value of the area-wide approach, and we hope and believe, based on our conversations with EPA, that they're going to recognize area-wide in the context of their grant funding program. I'll talk about that in a moment. And then there is a provision in the BUILD Act that calls for a program to provide grants of up to $20,000 apiece to small communities, which is defined in the congressional law as 15,000 population or less, and disadvantaged communities, which also has a definition that's fairly flexible from the congressional law. So small and disadvantaged communities, EPA and the states can put money into special programs to help deal with particular problems the small and disadvantaged communities may have and their capacity to move brownfields forward. And we support that. We've provided a lot of comments on how that can be done, and we especially want those to be done in states that are really committed to working with their small and local communities. We don't want states to gobble up the funding that's dedicated to this. We want them to get it on the ground in a proactive way with communities that are seeking to make a difference on their brownfields. All right, Ken, we'll go to the next slide, which is what we hear about how EPA is going to actually implement this. There has been no official written documents or major presentations put out by US EPA's Office of Brownfields yet, but we have heard some news that they're likely to be bringing out the guidelines for EPA assessment, multi-purpose, and cleanup grants as early as mid-October, with grants are typically due 60 days later, so it would be before the holidays in December. And that guidance will have new information about how the BUILD Act impacts the EPA Brownfields grant program. And what we're hearing is that for the cleanup grants to go up to $500,000, there's normally a 20% cost match. So a $500,000 grant would require a $100,000 match. The word is that EPA will waive those for localities that are smaller than 50,000. I certainly think that would be welcomed by many small and medium-sized communities. Multi-purpose grants, we have urged EPA to not put a strict parameter on how big these can get, but the word is that they're going to, in this initial year at least, in the absence of a boost in congressional funding that provides more room for giving bigger grants, they're going to look at $800,000 grants, and in this pilot year, they're talking about 10. I don't know that they're going to strictly limit that to one per EPA region, but it wouldn't surprise me if that's their aim is to get one into every EPA region. And so they're going to be highly competitive and highly coveted. They're big grants. There will be no Brownfield revolving loan fund contest in this coming year of FY 2019. They plan to do supplemental RLFs that will give increased pots of money to those existing RLF grantees who have demonstrated an ability to draw down their funds and get their money out into projects. And then the RLF for new grants would return in 2020. Likewise, we hear that there'll be no, they call them environmental workforce grants, therefore training people to be skilled in the brownfields assessment and cleanup and other environmental workforce areas. Those will not be coming out this year. They'll be in 2020. And then we have heard that the area-wide planning grants will not be done as a standalone program as it has been done for the past 8 years or so, but instead would be an explicit activity integrated into assessment grants. We're very hopeful that that is in a real way, and we look forward to folks like you working with folks like us to urge EPA to make those area-wide activities work really well. Okay, next slide.
Great.
And it's back to you,
Thanks,
Ken.
Matt.
All right.
Thanks, Matt. So I'm going to talk briefly about funding. Whoops, I got my slides out of order here. So I'm going to go to this one, and then I'll move up. No, here we go. There we go. So I'm going to talk briefly about funding of the EPA Brownfields program, and also funding of the HUD Community Development Block Grants and Section 108 and the Economic Development Administration, since a lot of communities use those funds to support their brownfields projects. So the good news overall, couple of things. One is that unlike almost every year in my recent memory, probably going back at least 10 years, Congress is actually relatively on schedule and has a chance to get some of its funding bills done by September 30th, which is the end of the fiscal year. In fact, the appropriations bill that includes EPA funding is scheduled tomorrow for consideration by a House-Senate conference committee, which would, once it gets through that step, it will be positioned to go to the House and Senate floor for final passage probably next week. And the same is true with the HUD funding. The EDA funding is not quite there yet, so I'm not sure what's going to happen with that. And then the second thing is that all of these programs are on course to receive the same level of funding as they got last year, the current year, FY 2018, fiscal year 2018. So that's, I mean, it's not great news. We're not seeing increases, but at the same time, we're not seeing cuts. So we're seeing maintenance of funding at the same level. Very briefly, you can see here on a table, actually there's a mistake on this table where it says 90 million in the House. It's actually 80 million, I believe. Anyway, the House and the Senate have the same numbers, and we're on track for the EPA program should get the same amount of funding as the current fiscal year, which would be 80 million for grants, 47.7 million for the state and tribal programs, and then 25.6 million for EPA management of the overall program. For HUD, I think as many of you know, the CDBG program provides flexible funds by formula to communities 50,000 population and higher, and those funds can be used for planning, assessment, cleanup, infrastructure redevelopment, and many communities have used those to support their brownfields projects. The administration, as you probably know, proposed elimination of the CDBG program, but both the Senate and the House are proposing to fund it at the same level as last year. So that looks good. The Economic Development Administration, in particular, they provide planning funds, and then they also provide public works and infrastructure funding, which can be used for roads, bridges, water and sewer systems, some building construction for buildings owned by public or nonprofit entity that can be part of brownfields redevelopment projects. In particular, EDA funding has supported many small and rural communities. Again, the president has proposed the elimination of the entire EDA and its programs, but again, this is another program that's had strong bipartisan support over the years, and both the Senate and House have included $301.5 million, which is the same as the current fiscal year. So overall, Congress is on track to get funding approved possibly by the end of the fiscal year, and if not, shortly thereafter, which is better than recent years, and we are on track to see basically maintaining the current funding levels. I will say, and I'll talk a little bit more about this later, is that one of the things we'll be looking to do when folks are in DC is to start making the case for the next budget cycle. The appropriations process really kicks off with the president's budget announcement in February, and then the appropriations subcommittees will typically take action in March and April, which is the most important period. We're looking to really start now to build support for increasing funding for these programs next year. So with that, I'm going to turn it back to Matt to talk about implementation of the new Opportunity Zones program.
All right, what an opportunity. So let me get to my slide. Okay, great. So the tax cut bill that was signed into law in December 2017, the Tax Cut and Jobs Act, had the Investing in Opportunity Act included within it. It's a bipartisan legislation that is meant to encourage high net worth individuals, normal individuals, corporations, and others that have money that is otherwise subject to capital gains tax, which is normally a 20% tax, to invest in low-income census tracts that are designated as opportunity zones. If those funds are put into so-called opportunity funds, and those funds go into qualified opportunity zones, then you can get capital gains tax breaks that I'll explain a little bit more. And the couple things that I would say about this act is, first of all, the zones are in areas that have characteristics that make them eligible for new market tax credits. And for any of you who have worked with new market tax credits, they're very valuable and helpful, but they are exceedingly complex to use. They require massive amounts of money to go into middlemen and transaction costs. The opportunity zones is meant to be a much more streamlined and kind of self-affecting provision where those with money that's otherwise going to be taxed with capital gains liability can put money into funds that go into these opportunity zones, and it's supposed to be much less complex and onerous than the typical new market tax credit deal. So how does it work? Governors were given the opportunity, and territorial areas, actually Puerto Rico, the entire island of Puerto Rico is a designated opportunity zone. But governors were asked to designate low-income census tracts that they were allowed to designate up to 25% of the census tracts that meet these new market tax credit low-income community definitions. And these governors made these designations in the spring of 2018. Treasury affirmed those designations. There are now 8,762 census tracts that are designated opportunity zones. If an individual that has money that's otherwise subject to capital gains puts these funds into an opportunity fund that invests in an opportunity zone, the money has a deferment of capital gains liability for up to 5 years. You don't have to pay those. If you keep your money in that investment for more than 5 years, then they step up the basis of your investment by 10%. That is, they essentially tax you on only 90% of the money that was otherwise going to get capital gains liability instead of 100%. If you keep the money in for 7 years, you can step up the basis another 5%. So after 7 years of investment, your taxes are on 85% of, let's say you put $1 million into an opportunity fund. The opportunity fund gets invested into opportunity zones, a zone or different zones. We'll talk a little bit more about those funds. After 5 years, you're only going to be taxed on $900,000, not $1 million. After another 2 years, at 7 years, you'd only be taxed on $850,000. So the 20% tax on $850,000 is a lot less than the 20% tax on $1 million. And if you leave the money in for 10 years, any gain that you make on the money after you put it in the opportunity fund. I put $1 million in an opportunity fund in 2019. After 10 and a half years, that real estate investment, my interest, is now worth $3 million. I've got a $2 million gain on that original $1 million investment. Guess what? If you sell that asset, you cash it out, you've got the $3 million in your pocket, and you're going to have to pay a 20% on a $2 million gain. Guess what? There's no capital gains tax liability on any of the gain during the time that you had it in the opportunity zone. So the deferral of initial taxes, the reduction of those taxes, and then the exclusion from capital gains tax of anything that you gain during the investment period could make private capital really interested in these opportunity zones. Just a couple points here. One is that the law is not meant to encourage quick flipping of investments, money in and money out to make money. It's got to be patient capital. It's got to invest in a low-income community for a long haul, 5, 7, 10 years or more, which should be good for communities and their investments. And the other thing is, look up at that second bullet. It is estimated that there is $6.6 trillion of unrealized capital gains tax money out there that could benefit from all this. If you just put a small percentage of $6.6 trillion into our community revitalization, that's a lot of money that could be looking for these kinds of investments. So Treasury's issued some guidance on some issues, but the critical guidance is really about how these opportunity funds can be set up. What are the rules for banks and investors and community development entities setting up these opportunity funds? It's expected. Well, I learned a week ago that it'd be 4 to 6 weeks. So in theory, it's 4 to 5 weeks. Maybe by Halloween, we are going to have guidance that will say how the big banks, the investment firms, community finance, nonprofits, folks have probably heard of the Local Initiative Support Corporation, or LISC. You might have heard of the National Development Council. Groups like the Kresge Foundation and the Rockefeller Foundation are all considering setting up opportunity funds that can go into these kinds of investments, as well as, we know the big banks will be doing it as well. So a key issue is whether money that goes into a brownfield remediation, well, cleanup dollars, can they use opportunity funds? Can brownfields be cleaned up with opportunity funds? And that guidance is not issued, but from the discussions that U.S. EPA's Brownfield office has been having with the U.S. Treasury, we do believe that opportunity funds can be put into brownfield remediation and revitalization. We'll talk about that a little more on the next slide. All right.
Next slide is up.
All right. So let's say you have an opportunity zone or more than one opportunity zone in your community. What should you really be prepared to do? There is a clock on the benefits that Congress provided in the Opportunity Act, and people are going to be looking to get opportunity fund investments into opportunity zones sooner rather than later. If there are 8,700 of them out there, I can assure you that money is just not going to float out of the sky from heavenly opportunity funds and land in your community. It's going to be the proactive communities that understand, harness, and work on the opportunity zone initiative who are going to be able to attract investment to their opportunity zones. So first of all, if you're coming to the Brownfields Leadership Summit in a couple of weeks, and even if you're not, please contact your two senators and your Congress member or members who represent your community. We need to get this guidance out. The clock is ticking. Some of the benefit that Congress provided is already, the window is getting shorter every day. So we need Treasury to issue this guidance for how opportunity funds can be established. We want the Treasury to make them as flexible as possible and the kinds that can be created. It shouldn't be only one segment of industry or only big banks or only certain kinds of entities that can set up opportunity funds. If we want to have community-specific opportunity funds that just are focused on your own community or your own region, if we want to have nonprofit community developers able to set these up, we need rules that are flexible. And then we definitely want to confirm in the Treasury guidance that brownfield remediation costs can use these funds. We are happy at CCLR to help you put together those letters and be part of the summit in the end of September to send those messages. Perhaps the most important thing you can do is that second bullet, identify and package your opportunity zone opportunities. You really, as a community with your economic development teams and your chambers of commerce and your investors and your community development organization should be putting together pitch books, should be putting together PowerPoint decks, should be putting together websites that say, here are the opportunity zones in our neighborhood. Here are the qualities and characteristics of our community and our zones. Here are the assets we have. Here are the development initiatives that we're promoting. Here's why we have a good labor pool. Whatever your assets and opportunities are in your zones, you need to sell them to investors. And then you need to say, what are those investment-ready projects that have funding gaps? You've got a big mixed-use redevelopment. You've got a building that somebody's trying to build, but they are beyond the concept stage. They're through a significant level of project planning and preparation, but they have a funding gap. And those project directors or owners or developers are willing to take equity investments from opportunity funds to fill that gap. You need to put together a pitch book and information about about the projects in your own community that are ready for investment. And then you need to reach out to the investment community. There's a whole coalition called the Opportunity Zone Coalition that's mostly financiers and banks that has come together. There are other ways that you can find the big, medium, and little investors that are going to be setting up opportunity funds, and you need to say, our community has identified our projects, identified our assets. We have a need of investment. Come here, and you can put your opportunity funds to work. So one way to get ready for that is to convene a workshop or a forum that brings together project developers, landowners, your chambers of commerce, your community development entities, your city or county's economic development leadership, your political leadership, the state economic development office, to talk about how are we going to get opportunity funds in our community, what projects are the low-hanging fruit for having an opportunity zone win in our community, who do we know who's setting up funds, and even if you look at that second to last bullet, some communities are talking about creating community-targeted opportunity funds. I work with the city of Lansing, Michigan. Mayor Andy Shore of Lansing, Michigan would like to work to create a Lansing Regional Opportunity Fund, go out to Michigan State University Spartan alumni and say, if you want to invest back in the community that you are loyal to as an alumni, put it in the Lansing Opportunity Fund. Go to those high net worth individuals and leading corporations in the Lansing area and say, this is a fund where you can reinvest in your own community and get these big tax breaks. Those are what the most proactive communities are doing right now, and you ought to look at that technique as well. And it's tough to predict the future. It's tough to predict what Congress may do in the future, heavens knows. But we do know that the original authors of the Opportunity Fund Act, the backers and the community that have been really working to make this a reality, would like to get real investment in the existing 25% of low-income communities that were designated as opportunity zones, so that we can come back to Congress at some point and say, you ought to allow us, our governors, to designate the next 25% of low-income communities, the next tier. And Congress won't do that if we're all sitting around hoping that opportunity fund investments happen. We need to make them happen, both for our communities and for the progress of this exciting initiative. So, Ken, I think that takes care of opportunity zones, and I'll send it back to you.
Great. We had a couple questions that I want to take before we jump into the next section. This one's on the opportunity zones, Matt. Did Treasury hold any hearings on the guidance or any kind of public input process? And if so, who did they hear from? Do you know?
Well, I don't know what's happened every day and every moment and the depth and breadth of all of that, but it is my perception that there was little, if any, public process. There are a lot of folks that gave public input to Treasury, including I've worked with communities to put input in, but I have not seen any solicited. It's very difficult to find information about the opportunity zones at Treasury. And so the answer is no. Treasury, in my 25 years in Washington, has not always been the most connected to communities. It just doesn't seem to be their style. For better or for worse, I think it's for worse. I don't think so. What I would urge people to do is to Google Economic Innovation Group. There's a firm called EIG. The young fellow who invented Napster. Remember when getting music files on the web was a new and unusual thing back in the Napster days? Now we all do it. That fellow started the Economic Innovation Group, and it is probably the leading edge organization that is working on opportunity zones, and they have a wealth of information on their website.
Great, thanks. And then the second question was on the multi-purpose grants, and the question was, can multi-purpose grants be community-wide, or can coalitions submit a multi-purpose grant? And I would say, in answer to that, the multi-purpose grants, I'm sure they can be community-wide, and that was the intent. And I don't know whether EPA would allow coalitions to submit a multi-purpose grant application. So I don't have a sense of their thinking on that. Matt, anything you want to add to that?
I agree with all that you said. I would add that I would be surprised if they took coalition multi-purpose applications at this stage, but we don't know.
Okie dokie. Thank you, Matt. And again, if you have questions, please just type them into your question section. For quick reference, for those of you coming to Washington and otherwise, these are some of the key people in the House and the Senate in terms of funding of federal brownfields programs. And now we're going to talk a little bit about the National Brownfields Leadership Summit. So again, the agenda for the summit is Tuesday, September 25th. We're going to all be together at the Hill Center, which is a conference facility on Capitol Hill. And we will be engaged in roundtable discussions with the various federal agencies. And then on Wednesday, September 26th, we will be going up to Capitol Hill. We will start the day in the morning with a briefing where there will be a couple of members of Congress. We're inviting Congressional Staff, and some of the folks involved in the summit will be making presentations there. Then following that briefing, we're going to be organized into teams of about, anywhere from 3 to 6 people, and we will schedule meetings for the teams to go around and meet with key congressional offices for the rest of the day. Very briefly, why is it important to meet with your policymakers? One, it enhances your organization, gives you increased visibility, and can help you achieve your goals, whether you're a local community, a private entity, a nonprofit organization. It helps you advance policies, and it helps you build long-term relationships which could help you achieve policy goals or win funding for projects that you're interested in. Secondly, in thinking about being effective in your education or advocacy of elected officials, remember that all politics is local. Members of the House and the Senate care most about what's happening in their districts or their states. So you really want to educate officials about the value and benefits, not of clean transportation policies, but of brownfields policies and funding for your area, and provide facts and figures on how brownfields revitalization is cutting jobs, creating jobs, helping your local economy and otherwise benefiting your community. And the most effective thing is to provide examples of local projects in action. Finally, it's effective to demonstrate that there's broad-based and bipartisan support in your community for the things that you're advocating. So this is what CCLR is going to do. As I mentioned, we will be forming teams probably on a regional basis, largely. We will be scheduling meetings with key offices, and then we will be preparing talking points and handouts that you can use. We will have the talking points and handouts developed in advance so that you can we'll either email you if you're participating, or we'll give you a link so that you can access them on the CCLR website. In terms of preparing for your meetings with congressional offices, it's very effective to prepare a one-pager, no more than front and back, with background on your organization and examples of projects that you've been involved in. You want to use those examples in your meetings. Visual displays are helpful also. So if you have any photos or maps that you can display at the meetings, not necessarily big ones, but manageable pieces of paper, or you can even bring up things on your laptop. I've seen people do that effectively in meetings. Remember your business cards and pen and paper to take notes. Keep your phones on vibrate or silent, and wear comfortable shoes. You will be doing a lot of walking from about 10 in the morning till the middle of the afternoon, so be sure to wear comfortable shoes if you're going to meetings on Capitol Hill. Meeting tips. When you're in your meetings, you should expect your meetings to usually last at least 15 minutes, and very rarely will it last more than 30 minutes. So you want to be brief, keep your presentation relatively short, and make sure you leave time for questions and discussion. You want to achieve two things in your meeting. One is to educate them about what you're doing locally, and two, to get them focused on the issues that we care about in terms of requests for action, whether that's implementing the opportunity zones or increasing funding for the programs that we care about. The more you know about the offices you'll be meeting with in advance, the better. Be factual, so know the most up-to-date facts about what you're talking about. I don't think we have much opposition, so don't have to worry about that. It's important that you want to build a long-term relationship, so even if the folks you're meeting with don't fully agree with you, you should respect their views as you would expect them to respect your views. And if you don't agree this time, there are usually opportunities to work together in the future. As a way to structure your meetings, this is the typical thing we recommend. One is you'll have a team leader who can help introduce your team, and each of you introduce everyone and your overall reason for being there. Then provide a couple of local examples of Brownfields projects in action, and then talk about our specific policy requests. And then again, as I said, you want to leave time for questions and follow-up. Some of the key messages, and these are mainly directed to the EPA Brownfields program, but I think it's important to emphasize that there always has been and there continues to be strong bipartisan support at the local, state, and national level for Brownfields programs and funding. If you take a look at the EPA program, I think you've seen these numbers before, but the EPA program, they've done analysis and that shows the economic results produced, including leveraging jobs, as well as leveraging additional dollars for redevelopment and increasing local tax revenues. Clearly, we have documented environmental results that have been produced, and EPA analysis shows that every dollar that EPA has spent leverages another $18 in additional revitalization investment. So those are the kinds of things that we'll include in your talking points that you can use in your meetings. Remember after the meeting to follow up and follow through. So if they have a question for you, if you don't know the answer, don't fudge it. Find the answer and get back to them. It's great to send follow-up thank you notes, either handwritten or by email. It's incredibly valuable to stay in touch. I know many of you do this with your congressional offices by sending them, press releases, reports, newsletters, or any other regular updates on your projects. Remember to invite elected officials to ribbon cuttings, workshops, and other local events. And then it's very effective to identify opportunities for media coverage, not only for your projects, but for your elected officials, to involve them as supporters in your projects. The more you stay in touch, the more effective you'll be. And in wrapping up, I just want to emphasize what an important time it is now for brownfields and overall redevelopment opportunities. We have two new things taking effect that we've talked about today. The Brownfields law is just about to take effect. The opportunity zones are going to be launched very quickly. And then in terms of funding, I think, as everybody knows, the administration, we'll see what happens in their next budget, but in their first two budgets, they've proposed significant cuts to many of the programs that we care about. So it's really important to stay vocal and active with the Congress, since they're going to ultimately decide funding levels. And what we're really doing, since they're almost done with the FY 2019 funding processes, we're really laying the groundwork for the next fiscal year, 2020. And it may be a tougher fiscal year because shortly after President Trump was elected, the Congress and the administration agreed to overall funding levels for 2 years, and that was for fiscal year 2018 and 2019. Which made the process last year better, and this year way better, because they had an agreement very early in the year on what the overall spending levels would be. We have no agreements for 2020, and they could be potentially contentious. And with budget deficits increasing, I'm pretty confident that there will be some who will be looking to cut budgets. So it could be a tough budget year next year. So again, this is a very critical time. Finally, thank you again to our sponsors. Register for the Leadership Summit if you haven't yet. And here are Matt and my contact information. Obviously, feel free to contact us at any time if you have follow-up questions or suggestions. And I'm looking to see if we got any more questions. We do have questions. Let's see. One question is, when will we find out what offices we are meeting with and who our teammates are? We actually are putting that together right now, so we should have something by the middle of next week, which we can share with you on groups. Let's see. There's a question, has anyone from Treasury been invited to the summit? We've invited other experts on the opportunity zones to come. We thought they would be more effective than inviting the Department of Treasury, but we will take another look at that since somebody asked for that. I think that's a good question. So we will consider that.
Ken, this is Matt. I
yes.
would just say that the leadership in the EPA Office of Brownfields and Land Revitalization headquarters supported up to fairly senior levels of the Office of Land and Emergency Management and the EPA Office of Intergovernmental Affairs have been engaging with Treasury officials, and about 2 weeks ago met with Treasury officials, a big group, and really had a very positive meeting about the treatment of brownfields and the opportunity funds and zones guidance. And so we'll look at maybe some of those folks who were in that meeting, getting somebody over to the summit.
Great. So I think that covers all the questions. Let me take another quick look. Somebody asked, will congressional appropriators will we be meeting with them, and will they be key targets for our meetings? The answer is yes. We're going to be meeting with the leadership of the Congressional Appropriations key subcommittees and other members of the subcommittees, as well as folks who are involved in overseeing the Brownfields law and the tax laws, because they'll be responsible for the opportunity zone. So those will be amongst our key targets. Let's see. And again, we will share the presentation. And I think that covers all the questions. So Matt, I want to thank you for participating today. And thanks everybody on the webinar for participating. Again, for those coming to DC, we look forward to seeing you in a couple weeks. And if you haven't registered and you're still interested in coming, we still have a few spots left. We're filling up fast, but we still have a few spots left. And it's going to be a great Brownfields Leadership Summit. So with that, thanks everybody.